Hello everyone, and welcome to this introduction module to the Houdini Academy Procedural Asset Production Masterclass. In this video, we are going to focus on the user interface of Houdini and have a basic overview of its various components. So let's open up Houdini and let's have a look. So here we have Houdini and its user interface. To a new user, this might be a bit overwhelming, so let's get started and I'll show you each part of the interface step by step. The first thing I would like to look at is the top menu bar up here, which is where we can, for example, create a new scene file. We can also open up an existing scene file and open up some of our more recently saved files. Below this, we can find the recovery method for recovering our crash files. When Houdini crashes, this is where they will end up. This button will open up the most recent crash file, and down here we can find the directory where all our crash files end up in. Usually, when Houdini crashes, you'll be able to use your crash file to continue working where you left off. So, you can find it here. Next, we have the ability, of course, to save our scene. And then below this, we can set our project. Now, our project allows us to create a folder on the hard drive where all our files will be saved in, and it has its own substructure. So let's click on this, and then we can see what I mean. We can set a project name for our project, as well as where it's located on the hard drive, and that this is where it will be located on your disk. This creates a folder structure, if we were to save this out, with these particular folders inside of it. And we can also create our own folders, if we want to, by toggling on these elements. Of course, we can also remove some of the subfolders from being created by toggling these off. Whenever Houdini creates a project, or we use the menu up here to set a project, Houdini will start defaulting one of its variables called $job to this folder. And this can be useful because we can reference this folder really easily in our tools using $job. $job can be a variable you can use in your tools to make sure that no matter in what location on the hard drive it is, on whatever computer, it still works. It can still reference the files it needs, such as the geometry files or the tools inside this project folder. Moving forward, we also have the ability to import various files into Houdini, such as filmbox.fbx files. We can import an alembic scene file. And below here, we can also use this to import our Houdini digital assets. I'll go over this more in a minute. Here we can export various elements out of our scene, such as an alembic scene file. And we can also export our geometry from our scene to a filmbox.fbx file as well. In the next tab over, the Edit tab, we can undo and redo our edits. So we have the undo history right here. And this is done using the hotkeys Ctrl-Z for undo and Ctrl-Y or Ctrl-Shift-Z for redo, whichever one you prefer. Next to that, we can cut, copy, and paste. And this is done using the default Ctrl-X, C, and V. And then below this, we have our main preferences and settings menu for Houdini. So if we want to configure Houdini, we can do it right here. And there are multiple tabs here, but really they all open up the same menu. It just defaults to a different part of the menu. So let's say I want to open up the save and load options right here. It will scroll me down immediately to this tab. If I go back to the edit menu, I can also find other things such as hotkeys. And the hotkeys menu allows me to set various hotkeys for the program or reconfigure them. I don't tend to edit this too much, but sometimes if I have a particular feature I want to use and there is no hotkey available for it, I can go here and set it. In general, if you want to know what hotkey is bound to which function, Houdini is very nice to let you know this because you can often find it right next to the button, such as this. Scrolling down to the bottom, we can also find autosave. And autosave is automatically turned off by default whenever you start Houdini. And there is no easy way to turn it on by default. So In general, whenever you start Houdini and you want to use autosave, you have to turn it on here. Now, autosave is useful, of course, if your program were to crash. It will save your file at regular intervals, and over here in the Houdini preferences, this is where we can set how often it will save. Next to this, we can also configure in this part of the preferences menu where Houdini makes backup saves. So normally Houdini tries to make saves in a backup folder next to your scene file, and it will try to make numbered backups. I tend to keep this default because this is very useful. If you need to go back to an older save, this is where you can find them. And every so often I clean out some of my older saves to make sure it doesn't take up too much of my hard drive. But I would keep this at default because it can save your bacon in case you need to go back to an older save file. Moving on, here is the Render tab. And the Render tab accesses Houdini's rendering engine. Basically, there is Mantra, Houdini's main rendering engine. And there's, of course, RenderMan, which is more of an industry standard rendering engine. Not to say that Mantra isn't good or anything. Though recently Houdini also added Karma, though you can't find it in this menu. You have to find it through different means. And Karma is a more recent form of Houdini's rendering engine. Going down, we can actually access whatever rendering engines are currently enabled in our scene. So we can render out whatever's in our scene file, or we can render it out into mplay. And mplay is a separate little program that comes with Houdini that can be useful for viewing picture sets or sets of frames of a shot, for example. You can actually access mplay right down below, right here. Over here we have the ability to access our digital assets. Now, Houdini digital assets are basically tools. Tools that we can save our files into, save our node graphs into, and then we can hand them off to other people. The HDA is a format or a library of files that contains everything you need to have a tool as a standalone package. We can then hand it off to someone else or load it into, say, the Unreal Engine, so we can start using our tools there. And this is where we can configure a lot of the settings of these tools. There are other ways to access these settings. Oftentimes we can just right-click on a digital asset and access the same menu right from there. But this is where you would find it in the top window. And next we will find the Windows tab. And the Windows tab allows us to open up a lot of the windows that exist inside Houdini. Oftentimes we can find elements inside panels in Houdini, but there are also other elements such as editors that we may want to open up separately. So if you ever lose a window or a panel, you can probably find it here. Next we have the Help tab, and the Help tab is very useful because it allows us access to resources that allow us to solve problems when we don't know how a node works, or how a system works, or how to write a particular script in Houdini. In general, the Help tab is your best friend. And Houdini's help file is very extensive and very thorough. If we want to access the help files, we can click on the Show Help pane or Start Here button, or we can also access the example files from right here. If we click on Show Help pane, for example, we will get the help pane over here on the right. This will open up a new pane in Houdini's interface, and this will open up the help browser inside of that. If we want to look up some information about one of Houdini's nodes, we can do this here by typing, for example, sphere. And this will open up all possible options that Houdini can give us that relate to spheres. Then I want to maybe look up the geometry sphere node. So if I click on that, it will open up the help panel to the Houdini sphere nodes entry. In this case, we can find everything we want to know about Houdini's sphere SOP, including, for example, its parameters and what they will do. And down below we can often also find examples. So let's close that and continue. Next to this, we can also find other resources such as the sideeffects.com website. We can reset our viewport, and we can also access several online tutorials that are available on the side effects site. Next to this, we have the context in which Houdini is currently configured. This can be useful if you want to work in a different type of context, and it will set up your windows and panels in a useful way for that particular context. For example, if I were to click on the animation tab, it will reconfigure Houdini more suitable for an animation workflow. It will open up our animation editor down here. We will see our tree view over here. Our parameters will be on the right, and so forth. However, this course is mainly focused on creating tools for world building, so in our case, we're going to focus mostly on the build menu, the default menu that Houdini comes with. If we want to save out our interface layout, we can do that over here. Or if we accidentally put our interface in some kind of configuration that we don't understand and we've lost some of our menus, for example, then we can go over here and click on Reload Current Desktop, and this will reset our desktop back to what we were currently using. Next up, we have the shelf. The shelf is this bar here that includes buttons that are very similar to what you might find in other programs like 3ds Max or Maya. They are quick to use buttons that will activate a particular tool. So in this case, for example, we can click on the box button under the Create tab, and this allows us to place a box down into our scene. We can then go and click on the arrow button over here to select, say, a face of this cube, and then we can go to the modeling or say polygon tab and find the poly extrude, and then we can drag out an element from this cube. So that's very traditional modeling, basically. But Houdini has done a couple things under the hood, and you might have noticed that while we did this, Houdini has actually activated several things across its interface. This is because, unlike Maya or Max, Houdini is not a traditional modeling package. It's a procedural modeling package. And whatever we do up here on this taskbar is basically a way to do manual tasks or quick activations of node graphs over here. So what do I mean with node graphs? Is that, well, we've basically just created a box object, and then we created a poly extrude node and automatically linked it to the box and made it extrude one of its sides over here. We'll go over this more in one of the next videos. But it's important to note that what the shelf offers you is quick access to different nodes, but it is not the main way how you use Houdini to model. So hold on to your horses for that one, because it's going to be a big one. Next, we have the main viewport. So that's what we are currently looking at over here. And the main viewport includes several tabs that we can access that access different parts of Houdini's contexts. For example, the main viewport here that we see is the scene view, and this looks into our scene. But we can also access the animation editor over here, or our render view if we want to access Houdini's mantra renderer. And here we can view our compositing networks. Looking further, we have our geometry spreadsheet as well, if we want to see the various elements present on our geometry. So there's a lot of different tabs here that we can access. Next, we have the toolbar here on the left. And the toolbar gives us access to many of the manipulation controls that we can use for our viewport. The first one up here is the selection tool. And using this, we can select objects in our scene and manipulate them. Right now, we are selecting the object over here that encapsulates our box, the geometry container. We can use the movement controls to move this object around in our scene, or rotate it, for example. Next up, we can also switch our context to the geometry specific context. If I were to press the number 2 key, I will actually switch to geometry editing mode and jump inside of this object in order to edit it. I can now grab its points and move those around, and you'll notice that my arrow is currently oriented in the wrong orientation. You can press the M key to change in which orientation it's currently aligned. such as in this case, world. We can use the number 2, 3, 4, and 5 keys, respectively, to switch to different types of contexts in which to select our object, different elements of our geometry, such as faces and edges. Next, we can use the handle control to control more specific parts of our object. The handle control is context sensitive and responds to whatever current node we have selected over here in our network view. If I have my geometry container selected, I access its movement controls over here. So I can drag it around in my scene and it will update respectively. If I go into my geometry container and I access the poly extrude node that we used before, you will notice that the handle turns into a context sensitive extrude handle, the one that we used when we first used the extrude function. So the handle tool is very useful if you want to manipulate objects in your scene and don't want to mess with the controls in the parameter menu over here. Then next we have the ability to snap objects. This allows us to snap objects to various elements in our scene, such as the grid, primitives that we want to snap to, or points currently in our scene, such as the points on this cube. And then down below, we also have the ability to use our camera tool. When we click on the camera tool, we no longer select our geometry. Instead, we can use our left, right, and middle mouse buttons to rotate, zoom, and pan respectively. Next to this, we can also press the F key to frame ourselves on the most current selected object. In this case, this would be our box. If we were to move our camera off of our scene and we don't have an object in our scene, we can press the G key to return back to a global position. The F key stands for frame and will frame on whatever objects we currently have selected, whereas the G key stands for global, and this will allow us to zoom back into the global center of our scene. So very useful if you get lost. And this works the same in our network view as well. And last, if we want to move around our camera without actually using the camera tool, so say we are using our selection tool, then we can press the Alt key to temporarily toggle our camera tool on and off. However, in this state, we cannot use the G or F key to zoom to the center of an object. For that, you should still go to the camera tool, so you can press the F and the G key to zoom to either the world, global, or to the object that's selected. We can also control the perspective of our viewport up here using this menu. This allows us to set different perspectives, such as the top view and also the front view or the UV editor. So let's switch this back to the perspective viewport. And the last thing you might want to know is that you can actually turn on and off perspective in your viewport. And by accident, you might actually do this by pressing the O key. If this happens, your viewport becomes a little strange. So it's very simple to turn it off. Just press the O key again and it will turn back to standard perspective mode. Finally, we can control our cameras. Right now we don't have any other cameras than the default camera, but if we wanted more than one camera, we can create them here and set them right here, as well as tie our current view to the selected camera. Finally, on the bottom down below here, we have the ability to launch our renderer. If we have something in our scene that we want to render, we can press this button and it will activate whatever mantra renderer is currently enabled in our scene. So now let's have a look at the next element in our interface, which is the timeline. And the timeline is just like any other 3D application. It allows us to place keyframes and also to play them back. But we can also do other things with it, such as bind our assets to the timeline. So if I were to create a rubber toy, for example, which is one of Houdini's default geometry objects, and then place it down here in the network view, I can use the parameter menu up here to bind its various parameters to the timeline. Normally, if I were to change this value, for example, it will rotate the object. If I middle mouse click on this, it will rotate the toy. If I were to type $F, I will bind this parameter to the current frame, meaning that for every frame it will rotate 1 degree. If I press play, we're basically going to cause our toy to spin. If I type $T, I bind it to the current time, which will effectively bind it to the current amount of seconds that have passed, which will make it rotate, just not as much. So that's very useful if you want to quickly cycle through a lot of variables in your parameters, for example. Over here on the right, we have the elements buttons. These allow us to change what we're currently able to see in our viewport. So we can enable or disable the grid, as well as configure its current settings over here. We can change our lighting settings over here quickly. And going further down, we can also view different elements of our meshes, such as points, normals, and any other elements. Of course, if you turn them all on at the same time, it gets kind of messy, but it can be very useful if you need to know or see particular parts of the geometry that you're currently working with. Further down below, we have access to the groups and attributes list. If we have groups or attributes on our geometry, this is where we can highlight them in our viewport. So we will be using this quite a lot during the course. And if we have any custom attributes currently visualized in our viewport, which at this moment we don't, then we can do this over here. So the next thing I want to look at is the editor on the right over here, which is the network editor, and the parameter editor up here. These two allow us to control our nodes, and we'll be using these a lot when we work with Houdini. The network view down here allows us to place down nodes and link them up to create our node graphs, which eventually form our tools. And the parameter menu up here allows us to configure them. So let's demonstrate that by placing down a box. If I press tab while hovering my mouse over the network editor, I can bring up the tab menu, and from there I can type whatever node I want. In this case, I would like to get the box. If I then press enter or move my mouse over to the object and click on it, I can then place it down inside the network editor like so. This will in this case create a geometry object which contains our box, because we weren't actually in the surface operator context. I will talk more about contexts in the next video. For now, let's go inside of this geometry container and let's look at the box. Up here we have the parameters menu, and we can manipulate the parameters on this box by moving them around, such as the uniform scale, or its individual sizes, or its rotation, for example. And I'm doing this by middle mouse dragging and then selecting how fast I want my value to change. But I can also just type in here, say, a rotation of 50 degrees, and it will do the same. So I'm going to quickly change this box over to a polygon mesh and change some of its parameters and scales around. And then I want to color this mesh based on, say, its world space coordinates. So I'm going to place a color node down. If I press tab, again, inside the network editor, your mouse has to hover over it because the mouse position in Houdini is context sensitive when using hotkeys. So let's press the tab button and type color. I can then place down a color node, and then I want to link it up to my box by clicking the bottom nodule on this node and plugging it into the top nodule of the color node. Then I can render this color node, and now I need to change the value for my color node in order to actually see my colors change. Because by default, the color of any geometry in Houdini is white. So if I click on the color swatch over here, I can change the color to any other static value. Or if I want to, I can change my color type to maybe bounding box, which will make my box color based on the bounding box. The next thing that I would like to look at is how to manipulate the panels in the viewport. So as you might have noticed, we have actually moved some of these panels around. And when we discussed our windows earlier, we also discussed how Houdini is made up out of panels, or when we try to manipulate the layout of our viewport, for example. But we can actually change this by hand as well. Houdini's viewports are basically consisting out of panels, and panels can contain tabs, and tabs contain various windows and editors. Basically, just look at it this way. This here is one panel. Inside this panel, we have several tabs, and each tab contains a different type of editor. We can add more editors by clicking on the plus button next to these tabs. So for example, I could add another network view in this panel. We'll go more about how to navigate the network view and the parameter menu in later videos. For now, what I want you to understand is that when we are moving these around, we are actually manipulating the layout of Houdini. We can expand a particular type of window by clicking on the arrows in between the different panels. So if I want to expand this to almost full screen, I can click on this arrow to bind it to the right. This will collapse the right panel, or panel set, into basically this bar. And if I click again on the bar, it will expand it back to the middle. We can also flip their positions by clicking on the dotted line in the middle. If you ever get confused, like I mentioned before, you can go up here, go to build, and then say reload current desktop, and it should reset everything back to how it used to be. But we can also do other things. If I were to press the D key on my viewport, you can open up the display options for this particular viewport. If I press the D key on my network view over here, I will open up the display options for the network editor. So like I mentioned before, the hotkeys in Houdini are also sensitive. And last, I want to discuss how we can create floating panels, which is useful if we want to create a separate panel that we can just bring somewhere else, like off screen, for example, on our other monitor. If I click on the Window tab, I can go here to New Floating Panel. This will bring up a new panel, which also contains the option to create new elements, such as, again, a tree view or a parameters menu. And we can move this off screen. Another thing we can do is we can grab individual tabs from different panels and move those between the panels. So in this case, I can grab my geometry spreadsheet and drag it to my new floating panel. Or I can close it all together if I want. So go ahead and experiment with this. If you ever get lost, again, go up here, click reload current desktop, and it should reset the layout of your entire editor. So with that, I think we've covered most of the Houdini user interface, at least the top level. In the next video, I would like to go over the different contexts that Houdini has for its different node networks. So just now we looked at the object context and we looked at the geometry context, but I would also like to discuss all the other various contexts that Houdini actually has. So I hope to see you in the next video, and thanks for watching this one. Have a good one.